On December 2006, the United Kingdom made a payment of $83 million to the U.S. Treasury. This single transfer officially closed a ledger opened 61 years prior. 3 generations of British taxpayers had just finished paying America for the privilege of surviving the Second World War. But here is the central brutal truth omitted from every history textbook. That debt wasn't a cost of victory, it was the price of liquidation. The period between 1940 and 1947 marks the single largest peaceful transfer of geopolitical wealth in human history. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor, controlling a global empire where the sun never set and the pound sterling was king. Britain exited the war bankrupt, saddled with $31 billion in debt, nearly $500 billion today, its financial assets seized, its strategic bases leased, and its economic future dismantled by contractual obligation. This was not a friendship. This was a hostile financial takeover executed with cold mathematical precision by the U.S. Treasury while London was burning under the Blitz. The truth of Lend-Lease is not the story of a garden hose lent to a neighbor. It is the story of a foreclosure proceeding where the banker demands the deed to the family estate before handing over a single shovel. Here is how the United States systematically dismantled the British Empire, transforming an ally into a financially dependent client state, and why that same playbook is being used on American allies right now. 1. The financial blitzkrieg, cash and carries destruction. The illusion of indestructibility. In September 1939, when war was declared, the British Empire still represented the greatest concentration of wealth and power on earth. The financial figures were staggering: $22 billion in foreign investments, the modern equivalent of $450 billion. These assets, from Argentine railways to Chilean copper mines, provided Britain with a massive, perpetual stream of foreign income. The pound sterling was the anchor of global trade, and Britain's $6 billion in gold reserves trailed only the United States. Yet, this power was built on 19th century trade, not 20th century warfare. The conflict launched by Hitler was a war of machines, consuming oil, steel, and aluminum at a rate that defied all prior financial calculations. Britain, crucially, had to import almost everything needed to fight. The American barrier. The United States, officially neutral, erected a devastating financial barrier in the form of the Neutrality Acts, which contained the lethal clause known as cash and carry. The rule was simple, absolute, and crippling. Britain could buy American supplies, but had to pay cash up front and transport the goods on its own ships. There would be no credit, no loans, and no sympathy. America demanded gold on the barrelhead before the crates left the dock. The financial vice closed instantly. Britain was forced to spend its gold and dollar reserves at an astonishing rate, just to survive the first months of the conflict. Operation Fish, the Great Gold Exodus. To meet America's uncompromising demands, the British government launched Operation Fish in June 1940. This was not a military campaign, it was a desperate financial evacuation. Britain loaded its entire national gold reserves, $7 billion in gold bars and negotiable securities, onto battleships and ocean liners, and shipped them across the submarine-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada and the United States. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth in history, sending the British nation's treasures into exile to pay American invoices. By December 1940, the unimaginable had happened. The gold was gone. The liquid cash was gone. 7 months into a war that would last 6 years, the largest creditor nation on earth was utterly and unequivocally bankrupt. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had unsigned contracts for tanks and aircraft sitting on its desk because London had $0 left to honor them. The letter of humiliation. This was the context for Winston Churchill's famous letter to Franklin Roosevelt on December 8, 1940. While history remembers it as a plea for aid, it was, in reality, the negotiation of Britain's financial liquidation. Churchill, the master of language, was forced to deliver the devastating admission that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, could no longer pay cash for its survival. This letter served as the necessary legal prelude to the financial destruction that America was about to unleash under the guise of alliance. The cash and carry policy had successfully emptied Britain's treasury. Now, the U.S. was ready to take the rest. 2. The Great Asset Strip, Morganthaw's foreclosure plan, the bankers' demand. With Britain financially crippled, the U.S. moved from demanding gold to demanding collateral. The legend of Lend-Lease, sold to the public as Roosevelt's folksy garden hose analogy, was a complete fiction. The reality was a brutal negotiation led by U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morganthaw Jr. Morganthaw's position was simple and lethal. The U.S. would not provide $1 of aid until Britain proved it was completely destitute by liquidating every asset it possessed. In December 1940, before Congress had even approved Lend-Lease, Morganthaw demanded a full audit of the British Empire. requiring a list of every asset owned by the government and by private British citizens anywhere in the world. Britain, fighting for its life against the nightly Blitz, was told that the condition for aid was opening its books to a foreign power. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned, arguing that forcing a fire sale of long-term investments would leave Britain permanently destitute. Morganthaw was unmoved. If Britain still owned assets in the U.S., American taxpayers would not subsidize the war. American Viscos, the sacrificial lamb. Morganthaw needed a public sacrificial offering to satisfy isolationist critics in Congress who claimed Britain was secretly rich. He found it in the American Viscos Corporation. American Viscos, the largest U.S. manufacturer of artificial silk, was owned by a British company, Courtaulds. It was worth over $100 million and generated vital dividends for London. Morganthaw gave a ruthless ultimatum. Sell American Viscos immediately and deposit the proceeds in the U.S. Treasury, or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. On March 15, 1941, the British government was forced to seize the company from its owners under emergency war powers. The sale was managed by American investment bankers who knew Britain had no choice. They drove a merciless bargain, selling American Viscos for just $54.4 million, less than half its actual value. The money went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapon orders. This was a foreclosure, not a transaction between allies. The billion-dollar liquidation American Viscos was just the down payment. Morganthaw's ES financial campaign forced Britain to liquidate over $1.1 billion in American investments held by British citizens and corporations, investment portfolios built over a century. The U.S. Treasury meticulously tracked every sale, ensuring the financial stripping was complete before the full flow of Lend-Lease funds began. The financial center of gravity had officially begun its permanent shift across the Atlantic. The geopolitical pawn shop. The humiliation extended beyond liquid cash. In September 1940, Britain was desperate for destroyers to combat the U-boat peril. Roosevelt offered 50 old, obsolete World War I-era destroyers, rusting ships the U.S. Navy no longer wanted. In exchange, Britain was forced to sign the destroyers for bases deal, granting the United States 99-year leases on military bases spanning the entire Western Hemisphere, from Newfoundland and Bermuda down through Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Britain pawned its entire strategic footprint in the North Atlantic and Caribbean for 50 barely seaworthy ships. It was the geopolitical equivalent of liquidating the family estate for grocery money, gifting the U.S. the foundation for its hemispheric dominance for the next century. 3. The contractual death warrant. Article 7 and the cutoff. The poison pill of free trade. The Lend-Lease Act finally passed on March 11, 1941, promising $31 billion in aid to Britain. Yet buried within the agreement was Article 7, the contractual death warrant for the British Empire. Article 7 required Britain to agree to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war. This seemingly benign language of free trade was, in reality, code for the mandatory dismantling of imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic wall that held the empire together, a system of tariffs that favored trade between Britain and its colonies, Canada, Australia, India, over foreign rivals. This protected inefficient British industry from superior American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain contractually agreed to tear down its own economic defenses and open its vast colonial markets to American exporters. The British negotiators knew this meant the death warrant of the empire as an economic unit, but with German bombers overhead, they had no choice. They signed the capture of the future market. As the war raged, the wealth transfer accelerated. The U.S. economy boomed, its GDP growing 75% during the war years. American factories produced both weapons for the war and consumer goods for the global market. Britain, conversely, converted every single factory to war production and stopped exporting entirely, abandoning its established markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Who stepped into that massive vacuum? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made both Spitfires and refrigerators, radios, and cars for the rest of the world. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, gold reserves had definitively migrated from London to Fort Knox, confirming the permanent shift of the financial center of gravity. The 7-day betrayal. British officials believed that their sacrifice, fighting alone for 2 years and bankrupting the nation, would earn them generosity after the war. They believed Lend-Lease would continue during Reconstruction. They were catastrophically wrong. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. 7 days later, on August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated immediately and completely. American supply ships mid-Atlantic, loaded with food, oil, and materials for Reconstruction, were ordered to turn around and sail back to the United States. There was no transition period, no grace period. The lifeline was severed. The British economy, fully distorted for war production, was paralyzed. Britain faced starvation as it imported half its food and almost all its raw materials with dollars that had suddenly vanished. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, immediately calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk and would be forced to default and ration down to starvation levels within months. The final crushing act of the financial campaign was set into motion. Britain had to beg for a loan. For the final mortgage, the price of the loan, Keynes's plea for justice. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. He sought not a loan, but a grant of $6 billion, a retroactive payment for the sacrifice Britain had made in saving Western civilization. Keynes called it justice. But in Washington, justice was not a currency traded. The American negotiators were unmoved by the moral case. The war was over, and the political will was focused on fiscal restraint and suspicion of Britain's new socialist government. They offered a loan, not a grant. $375 billion at 2% interest, barely enough to survive. The loan came with a final devastating condition designed to destroy what little economic autonomy Britain retained: sterling convertibility. The convertibility trap. The Americans demanded that within 1 year, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for US dollars. The British had previously forced their colonies, the sterling area, to hold pounds, but banned them from converting them to dollars. This closed loop was the final protector of British industry. The Americans knew that if the window opened, the world would instantly dump pounds for dollars, because American goods were superior. Keynes fought the condition bitterly, knowing it was a death trap that would drain the loan in weeks. But the alternative was immediate collapse. The Anglo-American loan was signed in July 1946. Keynes died months later, his heart giving out under the strain. The inevitable catastrophe struck on July 15, 1947. The pound became convertible, and the world rushed to sell. The financial hemorrhage was so severe that after just 5 weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility, having burned through a quarter of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was total. The geopolitical transfer. The financial collapse of 1947 had immediate, permanent geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a secret telegram to the U.S. State Department, formally resigning its role as global policeman. Britain admitted it could no longer afford to finance the defense of Greece and Turkey against Soviet expansion. "We are broke. We are leaving," was the essence of the message. This triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States instantly stepped in to fill the vacuum, formally acknowledging that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. The final price was paid in decades of financial servitude. The $375 billion loan, a commercial debt, was not forgiven. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the U.S. Treasury. The payments continued through every subsequent era of British history. The final installment was paid on December 31, 2006, 61 years after the last gun fell silent. The payoff. Empire by finance. The British Empire was not conquered by the Axis. It was bought by its ally. The U.S. acquired the assets, the bases, the markets, and the geopolitical influence through a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. The United States emerged from the war, holding 2/3 of the world as gold and commanding the undisputed global reserve currency. It established global dominance not through military conquest of its allies, but through the strategic use of debt, forced liquidations, and contractual dependency. The playbook established on Britain in 1941, crisis creates dependency, dependency transfers sovereignty, is the blueprint for American global power that continues to this day. The British Empire defeated Hitler, but it was bankrupted by the price of survival. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw that the Lend-Lease agreement was the greatest asset stripping operation in history, executed with legal precision, while Britain was fighting for its life.